Bossing Lit with Mr.
Love you, Mr. Have you got a question for Mr. F? Then why not email the original bossman of English so he can answer it? He's none too shoddy at doing that. His email address is bossingenglishwithmrf@gmail.com. I have a question for you, bossman, and it's well tough. Macbeth is called a tyrant in the play multiple times. Just what makes this Scottish Jew so tyrannical? Can you help contextualize it? And who was this Machiavelli dude that eggheads often reference? How is he important to the play?
This is a really interesting topic, and one where I think there's quite a bit of leeway for creative interpretation. One of the things with Shakespeare is there's a lot of unknowns, so even academics aren't quite sure what text Shakespeare actually read or how he was influenced by them. Some we are, like Senecan tragedies, based on his education. He went to a grammar school, so he knew Latin, and he would have been taught in the classical grammar school way, learning things like rhetoric, which we see applied in his speeches, by specific characters such as Hamlet or Macbeth, certainly in their soliloquies. Scholars also recognise generic features of Seneca's tragedies in works such as Hamlet, which is a revenge tragedy. But with Machiavelli, it's a bit more complicated to spot whether there is a direct influence on the works, but there are certain things that I think maybe suggest there is, and that certain characters like Claudius, Macbeth or Lady Macbeth could be considered Machiavellian. When we read a scholar such as Stephen Greenblatt, more of him anon, we can see how certain ideas circulated in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, and certainly Machiavelli's ideas, which were already quite old by the time Shakespeare was writing his plays, could well have been in the air as part of political discussion or coffee house discussions, let's say. What is Machiavelli's A Prince? Well, let's read the back of the Penguin edition that I have. If a ruler wants to survive, he must learn to stop being good. That's a direct quote. Here's the blurb. As a diplomat in turbulent 15th century Florence, Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, knew how quickly political fortunes could rise and fall. The Prince, his tough-minded, pragmatic handbook on how power really works, made his name notorious and has remained controversial ever since. How can a leader be strong and decisive, yet still inspire loyalty in his followers? When is it necessary to break the rules? Is it better to be feared than loved? Examining regimes and their rulers the world over and throughout history, from Roman emperors to Renaissance popes, from Hannibal to Cesare de Borgia, Machiavelli answers all of these questions in a work of realpolitik that still has shrewd political lessons for today. Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into The Prince to see why I think there may be grounds to say that it has influenced some of Shakespeare's plays. Well, if we look at one chapter, which is called States Won by Crime, where he says, aside from lucky circumstances and positive qualities, there are two other ways a private citizen can become a ruler, and we should include them in our discussion. They are when a man seizes power by some terrible crime, and that's the one that's of interest to us. Now, when he discusses this, he looks at I think it's a Greek, Agathocles example, who did something very similar to Macbeth and violently seized the throne. And in there, he says something very interesting. I quote, "As I said, he had no backers or benefactors when he took power, but rose through the ranks, surviving all kinds of hardships and dangers, and when he'd got power, he knew how to take tough, dangerous decisions to hold on to it. On the other hand, we can hardly describe killing fellow citizens, betraying friends, and living without loyalty, mercy, or creed as signs of talent." So I think that's the crucial thing when I think of maybe Claudius or Macbeth. Those things, killing fellow citizens, betraying friends, and living without loyalty, mercy, or creed, are unworthy. And then he adds, methods like that may bring you power, but not glory. And I think when we look at Claudius or Macbeth, we may see someone who has attained the rank that they wanted of king, but have done so without glory by betraying social norms, committing revenge, fratricide in the case of regicide and fratricide in the case of Claudius, regicide in the case of Macbeth, and someone who actually admired under the influence of his wife. So I think that's kind of interesting parallel there between Machiavelli's thought and what we see in the plays. Furthermore, there are other chapters such as cruelty and compassion, whether it's better to be feared or loved, and avoiding contempt and hatred. For example, in the chapter Cruelty and Compassion, he says, "He should go about things coolly, cautiously, and humanely. If he's too trusting, he'll get careless, and if he trusts no one, he'll make himself unbearable." So the next step for you guys is to think a little bit more about how this pertains to characters like Lady Macbeth and Claudius and their possible Machiavellian ways of attaining power and maintaining power once they've gained it. For me, I think that Lady Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 5, after reading the letter, thinking aloud in that soliloquy, so that we can hear what I perceive to be Machiavellian thinking, how she's plotting and planning to seize power, would be one thing I'd focus on, along with Claudius's first speech, which I think is a masterful piece of politicking and brazen even, where he is almost taking risks with how close to the wind he's sailing in terms of, appeasing the population, getting them on side, getting them to buy into his new kingship, but also almost toying with them when he feigns grief, having been the cause of that grief unbeknownst to that population. He seems to relish the act of hypocrisy there, which to me feels Machiavellian in its political manipulation.
Well, that was a genuinely interesting response, Mr. F. I was not expecting that from you. Long, verbose, and, to use the damnable parlance of our times, when our times were the early 90s, wicked. Words of the week, tyrant and tyrannical. I kinda already know what these mean, because I'm actually proper cultivated for a little girl, but even so, I'd like a clearer definition, an idea of how these words relate to Shakespearean drama. Perhaps Keith can help.
From the Merriam-Webster Dictionary. Tyrant. Noun. Definition 1a. An absolute ruler unrestrained by law or constitution. 1b. A usurper of sovereignty. Definition 2a. A ruler who exercises absolute power oppressively or brutally. Tyrannical, adjective. Being or characteristic of a tyrant or tyranny. Despotic. I reckon ye old Macbeth is definition 2a, a ruler who exercises absolute power oppressively or brutally. At last, the plastic skeleton has some use. Huzzah!
Whoa, check your flow, Keith. That was well, Jackson. Totally Mexico. Ha ha. Anyway, thanks muchly. I reckon Mr. F is gonna expatiate on this theme, which just means, develop it in more detail. Am I right?
Yep, that's absolutely right. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to be referring to a book by Stephen Greenblatt, who is a Shakespearean scholar, called Tyrant, Shakespeare on Power, which is implicitly about modern politics. It's never made explicit, but implicitly it's about the rise of populism and certain modern leaders. You know the names that frequently come up, who either have or would like to adopt a more tyrannical approach to leadership. And he does this by looking back at Shakespearean tyrants. And with Macbeth, what's interesting is that he kind of compares that to Richard III. He spends a lot of time looking at Richard III, and then he switches to a chapter called The Instigator, and he finds comparisons between Richard III and Macbeth. And he says that with Macbeth, we have entered, quote, a different psychological and moral universe. This is because Richard III, and this is a direct quote from him, has tear-falling pity dwells not in this eye. So he has no moral compunction about the horrors he commits to attain power, which is in distinct contrast to Macbeth, who is horrified by the very idea of becoming king. In Act 1, Scene 3, we see he tells us, his hair is standing on end and his whole body is shaking at just the very thought of regicide. So instinctively, he knows regicide is wrong, and then he proceeds to spend quite a bit of time trying to talk himself out of it. And he actually needs to be talked into it or cajoled into it by his wife, who is the instigator of the chapter title, who, again, we might see as Machiavellian or a kind of fourth witch or sorceress, and she does this by attacking his manhood. And Greenblatt argues that the tyrant in Shakespeare is driven by a range of sexual anxieties, a compulsive need to prove his manhood, a dread of impotence, and a fear of failure. Other interesting comments he makes are in how willing the population is initially to believe Macbeth's story about the violent love he used to kill the guards. This is another direct quote. For the new regime, it is a convenient fiction, enabling as it does the official ceremonies that confer a veneer of legitimacy on his rule. Tyrannical power is more easily exercised when it appears that the old order continues to exist, and that these bystanders crave psychological security and a sense of well-being, can persuade themselves that the rule of law is being upheld. This is initially. Another interesting area he explores is how Macbeth reflects bitterly that he has defiled his mind and soul only to make the seeds of Banquo kings. And again, another quote, "The tyrant's sense of personal defilement is something Shakespeare suggested only at the close of Richard III. I rather hate myself for hateful deeds committed by myself." A direct quote from the play there. However, with Macbeth, it haunts him from the beginning, this, quote, restless ecstasy, this constant all-consuming anxiety that he has. Later on, he uses this idea and pivots back to Lady Macbeth when she says, "Naught's had, all spent," in Act 3, "when our desire is got without content, 'tis safer to be that which we destroy than by destruction dwell in doubtful joy." And here in Greenblatt's eyes, there's an understanding that tyranny comes about, as her words acknowledge, through destruction, the destruction of people and a whole country. Just a few more things from this excellent book. The bit where in Act 3, Scene 4, finding out that the plot against Banquo and Fleance has failed, in part, "I had else been perfect, whole as the marble, founded as the rock, and now he's cabined, cribbed, confined, bound to saucy doubts and fears." In either case, whether it's whole as the marble or founded as the rock, the dream is to escape from the human condition, this is Greenblatt again, which he experiences as unendurably claustrophobic. Here, as throughout Shakespeare, the tyrant's course of behaviour is fuelled by a pathological narcissism. The lives of others do not matter. What matters is only that he should somehow feel, quote, whole and, quote, founded. And finally, at the end, he talks about tyranny attempts to poison not merely the present, but generations to come. That follows with the desire to have killed Fleance, and so that's why he's mindful of the prophecy about Banquo's issue, becoming kings, and he says that tyranny attempts to poison not merely the present but generations to come, to extend itself forever. This is Greenblatt. Tyrants are enemies of the future. Two more things I think are relevant. Greenblatt makes quite a big deal about the mouth honour, the empty praise of those who are paid or compelled to praise him is the only reward he can hope to reap from his time in office, and that this leads to the nihilism of the tomorrow and tomorrow speech, which for Greenblatt is not some existential despair about the nature of human being, but really pertains to tyrants and tyranny and what always comes about, which is their doom, their failure, because it's the tyrant's fate to be a walking shadow, a poor player, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So that's an interesting take, because I've always read that, interpreted that in a more nihilistic, existential way, and here he makes it more politically existential, we could say. Finally, Greenblatt ends his essay chapter with a reference to the quote, "The time is free, showing us that tyranny has come to end when Macduff raises the cursed head of the tyrant." That's kind of interesting. I think that's something you could explore if you were to get a question on tyranny, how there is a sense of resolution and return to normality that is needed by both the politics in the play and without the play in the audience. Now, I will just add, if you're an A-level student, I would definitely recommend buying and reading Tyrant, Shakespeare on Power by Stephen Greenblatt, because that would cover AO5 and definitely some AO3 with his new historical approach to criticism of Shakespeare. It covers Richard III, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Macbeth. There's a few other plays in there, some of the history plays. Definitely one for you for AO3 and AO5 if you're an A-level student. If you're a GCSE student, you won't get specific credit for quoting a famous Shakespearean critic. I've written to the exam board AQA and checked that. So that's not an option. That said, if you can use some of his ideas or quote him and shoehorn that into your own critical argument, those top tier level 4 and above responses, there may be credit to be had if it adds weight to your own reading, understanding of the task that you're being asked to do, and it builds on that, adds to that in some way. It enhances your interpretive take on the question you're being asked to answer. So perhaps also credit under AO3, but that's what AQA have said. For GCSE, there's no specific credit to be had for using a named critic. Just thought I'd point that out to you, although I think that there's some interesting ideas there from an interpretive point of view that you could work with, let's say.
If you have a question for the original bossman of English, Mr. F, why not email him at bossinenglishwithmrf@gmail.com. He's got the party that is English lit. Mr. F will be back with more Felicity anon. Bye for now.
Do not know of what you spoke. Got your face is all the same. I thought of stealing the baby's breath. Stopped it when you came. Trouble stressing all